All right, everyone, let's get this started. Perfect timing. I think my cat is going to come and join us. Hi, Moshi. You have any questions for us? All right, so there is a small time delay for everyone who is live with us. When you ask a question, it takes a few seconds, not a full minute, but a little bit of time for us to get connected on your answer. So just make sure you post your questions in the chat if you haven't already emailed those questions to us. And for anyone who is missing this live, rewatching the recording, which will be posted, you can always send your questions to us at questions@p3permaculture.ca, and we'll be able to answer those at our next live Q&A. All right, so we're going to start with the questions that we have listed for us from the emails that we've received over the past 2 weeks. And we have a question from actually one of our students and clients of ours, Laurie, and she's asking, she's starting a new garden bed specifically in a field that has never been cultivated for vegetables, has nothing at the moment, just field grasses. And we chose this as our starting point for the live because we feel like a lot of people are going to be starting new gardens this year. A lot of people are going to be digging into the ground, or hopefully not digging if we get this question answered properly. And it's something that might be pertinent to a lot of you. So my answer to Laurie in this situation is, so her question first of all is, how should I prepare my soil? As you saw, there is nothing more than grass for the moment. Let me know what I should put right now so that I can plant in June. So what we're going to be looking at is, this is a bare field, and the goal is here to be putting in a vegetable garden. If you're having a small patch of your vegetable garden and it's not a very big installation, then you can go straight away with what's called a lasagna garden technique. I prefer this technique to any of the other ways of preparing a new garden bed, because when you do lasagna gardening, which for any of you who don't know exactly what that is, it's a layered technique of building soil that mimics what happens from the tree fall at the end of the year. So if you imagine in a temperate climate anyway, we get the deposition of all the fruits from the apple trees and so on, nut trees, apple trees, all these things. The fruit is decomposing, but also there's deer and other animals coming and eating those and depositing their waste, their fumier, their manure waste. So we have rotting apples and deer donations. That's your nitrogen layer. And then the fall comes and you get your leaf litter falling on top of that. So that becomes your carbon layer. So by alternating a nitrogen layer, carbon layer, nitrogen layer, carbon layer, we can actually build soil very naturally and in a very passive way that feeds the organisms in the soil, that attracts the worms, and that builds a really rich soil. And me personally, I've done this, and I had a backhoe that dug through half of the herb spiral that I did this in about 6 months later, not intentionally. They were redoing the water lines, and we saw that all of this material that we had laid was perfect soil, and this was only 6 months later. So you can plant directly in the lasagna gardening technique, but if you're doing this in grass that already has some unwanted plants like dandelions or runner grasses that are getting in the way, then what you're going to want to do is make sure you start with a layer of cardboard over top of your mowed weeds. So you're going to cut your weeds down. This is probably the only time that I recommend mowing anything, unless you're in a country that has snakes or ticks. But you're going to mow down those weeds, chop them on the ground. That's a nitrogen layer. You can add raw kitchen scraps or raw manure if you have it here. Then you're going to overlap your cardboard, and you don't put cardboard, just butt it edge to edge, because your weeds will come through. Go overlap 6 to 8 inches, 10 to 15 centimeters. It's a real big overlap, so the weeds have trouble getting up and through. And this is not only going to smother out the existing plants that are there and help them to decompose, there's a potato-based starch glue in cardboard that for some reason the worms are addicted to. They just love it. And so you'll end up, if you just put a piece of wet cardboard down on your lawn for a week and lift it up, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's just this party of worms going on down there. So you do this in order to smother out the weeds, and without using like landscape fabric or geotextile membrane, you're using the cardboard, which is biodegradable, and again, in 6 months it'll be entirely gone. You always soak it beforehand, so that way it's not pulling moisture from your bed. You always remove the tape and the staples. Now the staples are metal; they're technically biodegradable, but it's more so I don't bump into them or walk on them if I'm in the garden with sandals on, or if I'm digging bare hand in the soil. So you remove your stickers, remove your staples, and you only use cardboard that has black ink. Black ink is carbon based. All the other colored inks, if you're in Canada or Europe or the US, they are soy based, but a lot of that is GMO soy. And also if you're in other countries of the world, it may not be natural based ink. So we want to stay away from all the fancy colors, only use brown cardboard with black ink. And that's how I would tackle a new first garden bed that doesn't have, and the soil has not been tilled, the soil has not been dug already. It's just your best way to get started. Because for any of you out there who have dug gardens before, double dig. Anyone do a double dig? You can do a thumbs up in the chat if you've ever done a double dig. This died out very quickly in the 60s, but the idea was to dig 2 spade depths down. Not really worth it in the long run. But what you can do is, instead of doing all this backbreaking labor of digging your garden, you can literally build these layers, and it really helps build the soil. It attracts the worms in, and the worms are going to till the soil 5 times more than you will ever till the soil with a rototiller. But they do it in a way that doesn't damage the structure. It builds structure. It doesn't damage the drainage. It builds more drainage and aeration. It brings bacteria and fertilizer into the soil, which every time we till, we're killing bacteria. We're losing soil whenever it rains. We're causing compaction, and so letting the organisms of the soil do the tillage for you is the best way to do it. All right, so we've got a bunch of people joining in now. So welcome to everyone. If you haven't sent your questions already to us at questions@p3permaculture.ca, please drop them in the chat. Sun is going to be our moderator, so she'll be able to let me know when I've missed questions that you have asked, or things like that. Also, I'm going to be asking you to drop me a thumbs up every once in a while when we're talking about things that you are in agreement or not in agreement with. It just helps me when doing a live like this. Otherwise, it's just me and my cat Moshi in the room. So please feel free to feedback and drop some questions. If we can't answer all of the questions in the chat, Sun will be gathering these questions, and we will be doing a recording of the answers that will be posted again on our YouTube channel on the Q&A playlist, as well as the recording of this actual live session. So that's the first question down for Laurie. And the second question is just an iteration of that, is how to transform your lawn into a vegetable garden. The only variation I would add to this is that if you're going into a bigger garden, when I do the lasagna, I dig all my pathways to be level, as a swale would be a level bottom of a trench. I backfill them with wood chips, and that soil that you dug out of your path, I'll add that to my lasagna layer. So I'll do a carbon, a nitrogen, a bit of soil, carbon, nitrogen, a bit of soil, carbon, nitrogen, and then I'll save some of the nice soil for the very top to plant in. And you really just move the mulch aside, put a patch of soil, put your seeds down, and watch them grow and survey for weeds in that little area. Or you dig a hole, put your soil in, put your seedling in, and then tuck the mulch back in. And you always end the lasagna garden with a carbon layer. As you would see in the forest, the layer that's on the surface is always carbon. All right, we now have a question from Tara. Tara is also one of our students, and she's saying, based on the on this very limited information, we are wondering how you could personally deal with this slope. And so there's actually an erosion image that she's sent us, and this is a very classic image of a rural road, a dirt road that has a ditch been carved. And then you see the edge of the forest, and you can see the roots of the trees, the erosion of the clay or the gravel or the sand or whatever's there. And it's really that the ditch has been cut kind of sharply into the edge of the road or the edge of the forest. So in this specific situation, what you want to do is you want to look at, are there specific species that we can plant that are going to be able to stabilize that bank, but that are not also going to fill up the ditch? Because if you fill the ditch, then it's going to be very problematic for you to actually manage the ditch and clean it out. And then when they redig it, they'll be removing those plants. So unfortunately, the first thing that we need to do is look at the angle of that soil. So if you look at the typical situation, it's a very, very steep angle. And what we're going to want to be doing is taking that angle and making it a angle that natural erosion will stop at. If you look at how a slope If you've ever seen a hillside that starts to erode, it may be because it's really steep at first, but when it finally erodes, it erodes down to a specific angle that it stops eroding at. And that is natural angle of resting angle for that soil type. And that's the angle that we have to mimic when we're doing any kind of land forming. So those ditches need to be redug a bit wider, unfortunately, because there's trees up against the edge, or build a retaining wall that is out of stone or something like that. There is an option of doing something like a living retaining wall with specific plants. These, however, will take a longer time to establish, and this is the issue when you have active erosion. There is the problem of planting like willow, a shrub willow, or something like that we're going to weave into a living fence that will over time stabilize that bank and make a more vertical kind of retention wall. But in the interim, you're going to still have that erosion that's washing out. So it depends specifically on the soil types. If you're working with sand or we're working with clay, there's going to be some different options. But the best way to prevent those kind of erosions is to work with the natural slope of the land and to vegetate with the different species that are going to be exceptionally good for root stabilization. So there's some ground covers that are really good for this. There's some perennial grasses that are really good for this, clumping grasses, as well as your shrub willows, which are one of my favorite tools for any erosion management strategy in North America. If you are in the tropics, however, for any of you out there who are in the warmth at this moment, then you have the luxury of having vetiver grass, which is called engineer's grass, is another term for it. So we've got some growing in the kitchen, also known as perfume grass, and this has something like 12-meter long roots. So that's used in all these situations in the tropics. All right, so moving right along in our list here, I'm just going to keep marking them off so I don't answer double questions. No longer have access to rocks. Okay, right, so that's that one. So John has a question for us here. How do we seal water-holding elements like a swale, a pocket pond, or a large pond when you have extremely sandy soil? That's a really good question, John, because not everyone has the luxury of clay. And don't everyone hate on me for saying luxury of clay. Clay is actually a great material to work with, and you're better off having clay in your soil than you are having sand. If you have clay, you've got basically like a large container garden. All we now need to do is like build your lasagna layers until you fill your container with soil. If you have completely sandy soil, and anyone out there who knows this, drop me a thumbs up in the chat. If you have sandy soil, then you know that no matter what you put down, it just leaches and leaches into that sand like at an incredibly fast pace, right? So that becomes a really big problem really quickly. When we think about sand and its ability to hold water, it's really not something that we have as a characteristic of sand. But when you look at the difference between clay, which has a great ability to hold water, and sand, we need to understand what is the difference between these materials. And really, it's not a composition, it's about particle size. So without getting too technical, and because we do this in much more detail, it takes me about 6 hours to do soil, even a hint of justice, and we do that in our PDC course. But to get an idea of particle size in soil, if you look at a wine barrel, or one of those big blue barrels that you see around as rain barrels, basically any kind of standardized 200-liter rain barrel. If we use that as a base reference of the particle size of sand, right, we're just scaling up for a visual, then your 12-inch dinner plate is the size of silt, and then a dime, a 10-cent dime, Canadian dime, is the size of a clay particle. So to give you an idea, really you could have it silica-based, it could be quartz, it could be all kinds of other types of rock material, but these specific material sizes are what make it sand, silt, or clay, not the composition of the material. It's really particle size. So if you've got tons of sand, you've got these big wine barrels, and we need to break them down into smaller sizes. So how do we take a big particle and make it smaller? Now, this is where I'm not going to necessarily give you guys all the answers. I'm going to give you direction. What in nature makes sand smaller? Well, if you've ever looked around in the forest, or not so much in the forest, but if you go to those edges of the forest that are in the rocky outcroppings, or if you've ever climbed, done hiking and moved up in the landscape, and you see the hilltops that are all really rocky, you see specific species growing on the face of the rock. And it's actually most of the time lichen, which lichen is a combination of a green plant as well as a fungi. And it's the fungi's ability to exude acids and enzymes that will dissolve rock material into minerals that then can be eaten by that lichen. So not only lichens do this, but other mushrooms or fungi, specifically mushrooms really just being the fruit of the fungi, but these other fungi have this ability of exuding compounds that break down rock material and then allow that rock material to be smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you have a big sand particle, you need to increase the mycelium or the fungi in the area and feed them so that they have all the foods that they need to then begin exuding these materials to break your sand particles into more and more clay. Now, John, this is a long-term solution, so there is a short-term approach to holding water in a sandy situation that is going to buy you some time while the mushrooms or the mycelium have the ability to break down these particles. So if that's the case, if you want to increase your clay content in soil in general, you feed your mycelium with specifically wood chips. I prefer wood chips because they have a much higher carbon content than leaves or straw or cardboard or any of these other materials. And that means you have much more food for a longer time for the mycelium in the soil to exude the enzymes to break down the particles and give you some more clay. That's your long-term soil repair mechanism. For the short term, and actually this is Sepp Holzer's solution, and he was sitting there, and he lives in the Alps in Austria, and it's really rocky, gravelly soil everywhere. But if anyone knows Sepp Holzer's work, there are ponds all around him. But he couldn't build ponds at first. He was very confused as to how to build ponds in sandy, rocky soil. Yet his pigs had no problem making little wallows of mud puddles that held water very well for them to be able to roll in the mud. So he sat back and observed these pigs for a long period of time and understood basically that the pigs are doing two things. They're compacting, so as they roll around and trample the area, they're compacting it, so that's one thing. But before they're even doing this, they're in there eating and rooting, so they're eating all the grubs and turning the soil up, and then they're pooping in it. And so it ends up being a layer of manure and a layer of organic matter and a layer of manure and a layer of organic matter, similar to the lasagna, except in this case it's wet. And like in a swamp, it goes anaerobic, so lack of oxygen, which starts to break down in a fashion that provides the habitat for lots of bacteria. And anyone who's worked with bacteria before, or if you've ever had food that has gotten some bacteria on it in the fridge, you know so because it's slimy. So the slimes actually generated by bacteria are called gels and colloids. These are like glues in the soil. And so the more of these that you're generating in a leaky pond, the more every time it rains, it's washing those gels and colloids down into the cracks, and you are slowly filling those cracks in. So you can, over time, even in sandy and gravelly soil, build up the ability of that spot to retain moisture in the ground. So much so that Sepp Holzer, if you look at his aerial photographs of his property, he has ponds all around his home and his other structures. So there's definitely ways you can do that in that regard. We specifically built a pond in Wakefield, Quebec, a 2 megaliter pond with a 1 kilometer swale. And the pond itself ended up having a leak. And there was one point in the wall where the material was just not compacted enough, and there was a very, very slow leak. In this case, you're working with clay, but your compaction has not been adequate to be able to be very, very impermeable. So in this case, it's a different type of solution. So what we're looking at in the solutions that we have here is a type of material that we can put in an existing pond that has water in it. Either one has water in it, or you can drain the water out to apply it. It'll just take a lot less material. And then something that will go into those cracks and expand and seal them. And so what we use in this case is called bentonite clay. Bentonite clay is a expansive clay that when it's wet will expand to 5 times the volume that it was occupying when it was dry. So this clay, you will lower the pond down past the leak point, if you know where the leak point is. You will put about a centimeter layer of bentonite clay over that leak point, rake it into the topsoil, wet it down, and then fill your pond back up. Right? So this is a way of sealing a leak on a large holding feature. To get to your last point of your question, John, of the swales, I don't actually... when I make swales, we use the bottom of the swale as a water catchment that we can use to put it in ponds or to put it out in a safe erosion management way. But oftentimes we're using it as a soakage feature to add to our soils. If you have sandy soils, then you actually want it to be doing this and adding that moisture into the sand. If you have a heavy clay soil that's at risk of oversaturating, well, then we let the pond or the swale overflow. But I even go around when I have swales that are really clay soil, like a client we were working at yesterday, at the bottom of the swale, we'll actually use the broad fork and go in there and loosen up some air channels so that our drainage channels, so we have better infiltration of water into that. If you want a swale that is holding water at all times, that's actually not called a swale. That would be called a chinampa, which is a long, elongated pond structure that was developed by the Inca and the Maya. All right, so moving right along, we have, that was, I think, John, let me know if that didn't answer your question or if I tangented a little bit too much on that one. But that's how you would fix sandy soils, is with a gleeing technique. It's called gleeing, sorry, the pigs. And you don't have to have pigs, but you could put an electric, like a mobile electric fence around the area to protect them and to keep them in the area. And then they will do the work for you. You just put lots of food in there and they will eat and roll and poop all over it. Or you can do this without having any animals whatsoever, and you bring in duck manure and organic matter, and do multiple layers, and then do a fill of the pond, and then let it drain, fill and let it drain. It may take about a year or two, depending on how leaky your soil substrate is. And we have now Francois. All right, Francois has a question here. What is my opinion of burying cement as a fill? And is it any environmental issue? All right. So first off, let me just hold on one second. First of all, it is an issue environmentally because it has a tendency to change pH and change the salinity of the soil that it is surrounding. Because it does break down over time, you get different things breaking it down. It does affect salinity. It's a material, however, that is in existence. I use, we call it in the city, urbanite, just to sound a little more fancy, but broken pieces of concrete in an herb spiral. I'll use it in an herb spiral as the base material, and then I'll put fancy, nice rock on top if I can get a hands on it, just so it looks nicer. But what you have to understand is, in permaculture, we don't address things as a problem and then you do or you don't do, right? And many of you who have been in my classes before, you know that the answer is it depends, right? So when we say, do you want to not put it in the soil because there's a salinity issue? Well, actually what we can do is we can look at what in nature is able to break down salts and gather up the salts so that it's not a problem in the soil, and also what is able to then balance pH, which can be another issue when you have lots of cement, rubble, and debris. So the answer is, and if any of you have someone in your family that is like always collecting up all the useful things and keeping them for that one time when you might need them, which is totally me, I'm going to fess up on that one, that is what the mycelium do in the soil. Right, so the mycelium are gathering up all these nutrients, all these different salinities, all these and when we say salinity, I mean they're salts. They're not table salt, but it's a mineral salt, which means it will dissolve in water. Basically, that's what salt means in chemistry. So these salts, normally when it rains, would absorb these materials and then they would leach out and wash away. Mushrooms have the ability, or fungi have the ability, to really grab and hold this material in the soil. So if you increase the mycelial content in that soil, you will fight against the effect of the salinity, and the breakdown of the organic matter will help balance the pH as well. So again, solution here is a large volume of dense carbon. And again, my favorite source for this is wood chips. And if you're going to go for wood chips, go for what's called in Quebec the bois raméal fragmenté, or ramial fragmented wood chips. This means ramial meaning small branches, so we're going with anything under 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. And basically you're looking at chipping the leaves and the branches, because you get young branches that have more nitrogen in them, and you have leaves that have nitrogen in them. And when you have a higher nitrogen to carbon balance in that material, it composts and breaks down much, much better. And you end up with a really good soil amendment that still has tons of carbon to feed those mycelium to do the work for you. All right. So we're going to actually, Tara's got some other questions here about the soil that was slipping down the slope. So I'm going to jump in there and take a look at that. We've got the question is kind of broadening it out. Is this a risk of landslide, and which is something they would like to avoid? A few ideas would be general impressions. So just, it's not necessarily in this case risk of a landslide. It's going to slowly keep eroding, and that means if you dig those ditches out, then in a few years they're going to be filled back in because of the erosion. So yes, it is something that we need to take care of. What we need to do is need to have layers of ground covers, small perennial grasses, small shrubs, medium shrubs, and then bigger trees and forest. Whereas right now it's like forest and then the ditch and the road. And that always causes problems. Even those trees at the edge are going to be much weaker and more likely in a windstorm to blow down into your driveway or your road. So that can be a big problem. Yeah, no problem, Francois. I love those questions that have really great rabbit hole tangents. So if anyone out there has more of those are great. So that's the answer for these situations. If there's any, maybe Francois or Tara, if you have any other questions on that specific situation, let me know. Otherwise, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dig back into, we receive a lot of questions on Facebook periodically, and it's just become to a point impossible for me to answer them all. And so what we're doing now is these live sessions. We will see how many we'll do, whether it's once a month or whatnot, but basically based on your needs. To be able to help as much as we can for anyone that has lots of these little questions, because we know, when you're self-taught, when you're watching YouTube videos, reading books, there's just some things that need a little bit of clarification, and so the goal here is to help anyone moving forward in that journey to just get some quick answers to their questions. So let me just see if I can pull up some of these questions here. Okay, so this question is a big question, and it's actually a very technical question that has serious repercussions if it's not dealt with in a very serious manner. And this is a question from someone, I'm not sure if he wants to be named, so I'm just going to go anonymous, but the question is that they just stumbled upon the fact that the area that they're working in is full of quick clay, which is also known as Leda clay. Now, have you ever had any problems dealing with this in any of the soils that you've worked with? And in fact, the pond that we put in Wakefield and the swale system there was put in before we knew that the soil was quick clay. Not all of it is quick clay. It's that the area has a high likelihood of quick clay being in that zone. And quick clay, basically, to start from the beginning, is a type of clay that has okay, so hold on. Backtrack. I don't know how many thousand years, the Champlain Sea was present in this area of North America around the Ottawa, Outaouais Valley region, and Montreal as well. And when the ocean was depositing sediment material, the really fine particles that always go down to the bottom, and then you have silt, and then you have sand that lands on top. So that's that clay that sifted its way down to the bottom, which is now the clay that we find in the Outaouais region and in a lot of our regions around here, has a large portion of it been deposited when there was an ocean. What that means is that there are salt bonds in the clay matrix, in the actual matrix of the soil, there is salt bonds. Now, what happens when you have fresh water that rains on salt? The definition of salt is that it dissolves in water. And so you end up with the bond that was once a solid clay being pulled out by that freshwater material. So this is what makes these clays very, very fragile and very risky to be able to slide. So when we're working with Lita clay, you actually need to not delve into it as a few questions here and there and try and take care of it on your own, because if you fail in the way that you're working with this type of clay, it can mean massive landslides that are going to actually risk people's lives or damage homes or so on and so forth. And so just to begin, the answer to this is that you need to get a specialist on site to consult your property to verify whether you have high risk quick clays, to look at the earthworks or the buildings that are possible, because if they are not possible and you do put them there, you are risking wasting huge amounts of money and putting people's lives at harm. And if you Google on YouTube some different videos of what quick clay can look like when it starts to slip, it's pretty devastating and terrifying what can happen. So this is one of those little questions that I'm not going to answer, and I'm going to say that it needs a very case-by-case analysis. But if you feel like you're in an area of the Outaouais region or the old Champlain Sea and you think you might have quick clay, then you need to come and find an expert and actually get some analyses done, because there are ways to stabilize quick clay. We need to replace those salt bonds with other materials, but it's not something that I can answer safely for any of you here in a live session. So to end on a big note, that is where we are going to call it for today. For any of you out there who are watching and didn't get your questions answered, or for anyone else out there who has questions that are watching this afterwards, you can always send your questions to us at questions@p3permaculture.ca, and we will be adding those questions to the top of the list to answer in our next live session. The recordings are available on our YouTube channel in the playlist section for the Q&A live sessions. And don't forget to check out our other videos, link in the description of this video to where you can find all that material. We also have other online courses on our website where you can get some more in-depth answers to these different questions. If you have any questions, send us a message, please, to that email address, and we will do our best to answer them in a timely fashion. And if not, then that's it for today, and I will see you guys in the next video. See you guys. That's so from YouTube. Sorry. I'll see you folks in the next video. How's that sound? Cheers.